So today we're going to talk about innovation and creativity, and these have always been important. But in our view, they've never been quite as important as they are right now today. And I think this is the COVID effect. You know, we may feel that change has always been fast and unpredictable, but the world tends to work in cycles that we refer to as a punctuated equilibrium, where extended periods of relative calm are intersected by short periods of massive change. You know, if you look at a river can maintain its same path for generations, and then one massive storm or a mudslide or an earthquake can change its path in a matter of days, hours, or minutes. And I think COVID is putting us in one of those periods right now. We're right in the middle of it today. Value chains are being reconfigured, assumptions are being challenged, norms are being reset all over the world. I suppose some of you work for organizations where just a year ago, you know, there was an attitude that working from home isn't really working, or real work only gets done in the office. Do you still have this attitude today, or is that changed? You know, we see barriers dropping, minds are opening all around us. And this means there's great opportunities to innovate. Product, service, business models are being developed right now that are going to dominate the future. We're in a kind of a crucible of innovation. Organizations are being formed right now. They're going to dominate going forward, and others are going to falter and probably fail. We also today have more tools and technologies and methodologies available to help us to innovate and be creative than ever before. And yet, surprise, surprise, people are not being more creative just because the tools and the methodologies are available. It's more of a mindset that needs to change. And that's really what we want to talk about today, how to change your mindset about creativity and innovation. So in this session, Cyril Bouquet and I are going to introduce a new way to support innovation and creativity that you can all use. And we've been working on this for quite a long time. It's been quite a few years in the making. And you know, you don't need beanbag chairs. You don't need Post-it notes. You don't need fancy rooms or well-defined methodologies. You have everything you need right here in your heads and right here in your hands. So Cyril's going to introduce the approach, and then I'm going to come a little bit later in the session and talk about how it can be amplified through the use of digital technology. All right, with any luck, we'll have a little bit of time at the end of the session for questions. But in any case, if you have anything you want to add, any comments or questions, please just type them in the chat window. We'll be monitoring that as we go along. Apologies in advance if we won't be able to get to all of you. We're now almost 300, but we'll try and hit as many as we can. All right, Cyril, over to you.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much, Mike, for the introduction, and really delighted to be connected with you today. So in fact, I'm going to share my screen. As Mike mentioned, you know, we have interesting sort of insights that we would like to convey to you. And that comes from research that we've done. Indeed, a few years, you know, that gave us a chance to have many conversations with executives around the world who came to our programs at IMD, and also other pioneers and change makers coming from all kinds of fields, right? Not just business. In fact, we were looking at the essence of creativity. How can we give ourselves a chance to be innovative? And so we talked to people in business, of course, but also to people in sports, in the arts, architects, doctors, and we were trying to see what is it that we can learn. And of course, you know, we published a little article with Harvard Business Review about a year ago. And then, you know, we are quite excited because finally the book that we've been working on for so long is coming out actually in March 16. And this is the US edition that you see here. And actually this is the UK edition. And this is what we wanted to share with you a little bit of what has captured our thinking in the last few years. Mike and I are professors of strategy and innovation at IMD. So we have the privilege of working with executives who are part of large established organizations often. We also work with startups. But the common thread, if you will, across those organizations is that they are trying to innovate. They are trying to make sense of changes that are occurring in their industries and reposition themselves, bring progress to the world that we live in. But as Mike was saying, right? Even though they have a plethora of tools available to them, and mostly that's design thinking, the lean startup, and all the templates, the post-it notes, the big and the bean shells that come with those. Right, we've noticed in a number of situations, great ideas that emerge, but also a certain degree of frustration, right? Where companies are investing a lot of time and effort, executives themselves have the talent, the motivation, the will to bring change into their own organizations and the industries they work for. But somehow they find that game-changing offerings, truly radical change, is hard to come by. And so why is that, right? And we started to really sort of look at what could explain this difficulty that we have. And we realized, well, the key reason is that, those executives are somehow prisoner of a logic that exists. And that logic that exists within the industry, within the company, but there's a core set of beliefs that is impacting how they think about the future and how they conceptualize the range of possibilities that exist as they try to really bring ideas forward that could, totally reinvent the way things get done. And I have a little example of a company that actually I've worked with, for many years, and that's the train company in France, SNCF. And of course, I got those people, 650 leaders of SNCF, on a massive innovation journey designed to reinvent the train company and try to imagine innovations that we could bring to passengers of the train. And in the first phase of the journey, right, I conducted a lot of interviews with the senior executives, but also people in all ranks of the company. And I was asking them, when you hope, right, for the company that you want to build for the future, what is it that you see? What would be a good innovation for SNCF? And time again, you can see what is the image that people projected to me. And you can see on the screen, it's all about speed. In case you missed it, it's written 3 times, right, on the train. And it's interesting because that's what naturally people would talk about, right? Because they're engineers. They are proud of the technological excellence that SNCF has demonstrated over the years. But interestingly, there are so many other things that we could do to create a better train for the future, right? Sometimes when I travel with my kids on the train, I don't know how to handle them anymore. And because they get bored and they start to get really, crazy, right? Sometimes around me, and I wish, that there would be a way to entertain them that does not necessarily involve just iPads or reading books and so on. Sometimes I'm on the train and I'm working with a colleague and we can't really have a conversations because we are bothering other people who would like to be quiet. And so there are all kinds of ideas, right, that could be implemented to create different types of experiences on the train. But interesting thing is that, do you think the executives I worked with at the time started to visualize those ideas? Probably not, because it didn't fit, right, with the DNA of what they believed, was important to accomplish, right, in this company, what made them proud. And it was all about speed. So people are prisoner of the assumptions that really limit often, right, what they believe is an appropriate direction to pursue as a business. And they don't necessarily realize that they limit themselves in the process. And even when people sort of manage to come up with radical ideas in an organization, we are not quite sure how they will be welcomed. And here you have a picture of a concept that we've often mentioned in the big companies that we worked with, and this is this corporate immune system. You have a radical idea that is coming out, that is challenging the way things are being done, and the company is not quite sure how to deal with it. And so it might treat those new ideas as viruses that need to be killed, right, before they disrupt, again, the nice established order that has been functioning so well in the past. So we were looking for a toolbox, right? A framework that would really give an executive the capacity, that would give you the capacity to challenge those assumptions that are creating a lot of rigidity in the way that companies are actually thinking about the future, but also doing so in a way that doesn't expose those disruptive innovators, right, to this corporate immune system that will kill those ideas as they emerge. So what is the toolbox? And we have a little video that will walk you through the 5 dimensions, right, that we believe are important to give you the mindset of the alien who is able to see things in different lights and come up with more radical ideas for the future. Let's watch the video.
There are 5 essential elements that can foster big discoveries and innovation: attention, levitation, imagination, experimentation, and navigation. Alien. Attention is the act of focusing on a particular context or population. Who you pay attention to and what you focus on will dictate how you make sense of the phenomenon you're trying to change. Levitation involves stepping back to enrich your understanding. You need time and space to make sense of the world and to prime your mind for inspiration. Imagination is the act of envisioning that which is not, and then generating avant-garde ideas. Imagination is about connecting the dots in new and interesting ways. Experimentation means turning a promising idea into a workable solution that addresses a real need. Finally, navigation is the act of adjusting to forces that can make or break your project. Without buy-in from key decision makers, your solution may not survive first contact with the organization, investors, or industry partners. Let's see how alien thinking works in the real world. In 1999, Swiss adventurer Bertrand Piccard successfully completed his third attempt to circle the globe in a balloon. With barely any liquid gas to spare, Piccard realized he had spent 20 days aloft in constant fear of running out. As he waited for 6 hours to be picked up from the Egyptian desert, he suddenly saw that his core problem was not how to manage fuel, but how to manage without fuel. This set the stage for his next circumnavigation challenge, this time in a fully solar-powered plane. Solar impulse was born in this moment of levitation, when Piccard had no distractions and plenty of time to reflect. Next, Piccard paid attention to clean energy technologies, solar cells, ultralight aircraft, large capacity batteries, and electric motors. While several solar airplanes had been built, none had flown for days with a pilot on board. Aviation experts told him he was chasing an impossible dream, so he turned to yacht builders instead, who triggered his imagination. We can make your planes as light as you want because we know how to use carbon fiber. This was a paradigm shift from producing more energy to consuming less energy. 13 years of experimentation followed without ever flying the plane. Piccard created a digital twin of his concept using 3D software to design and test individual parts. Finally, Piccard demonstrated strong navigation skills to maneuver around the obstacles that stood in his way and motivate his team to persevere. There was nothing magical about the birth of Solar Impulse, except a desire to reject the status quo and embrace the alien mindset.
All right. So as you can see, we wanted to think about an approach to innovation that would give people the capacity to think like an alien, right? Get rid of those assumptions that are often limiting the way you think about the future in a company, in your team, in the industry. And the beauty of the metaphor is that it's not just, right, a metaphor. Is that in fact, if you think about it very carefully, right, they are very concrete things that we can do. In fact, 5 strategies that people can leverage. And so this is why the alien thinking metaphor is also an acronym, because there are 5 elements that really need to be considered if you want to go through any innovation journey and give yourself a chance to come up with more radical ideas for the future. And so we can pause and sort of look a little bit at those 5 different levers. And it all starts with how you look at the world, right? How do you pay attention to the world? We are constantly bombarded with information all around us. And it can be very confusing. So we naturally pay attention, right? We look at certain signals in the industry, certain signals of change. We talk to certain people. We have conversations, right, with colleagues. And essentially what we pay attention to, where we spend our time and effort, is going to impact, right, how we think about the future and what sort of ideas are emerging as a result. And obviously the problem is that we are often a little bit like this attention that we give to the world is colored again by what we've done in the past, right? So we kind of naturally gravitate towards ideas that look interesting to us, but they look interesting to us precisely because they fit, with the assumptions that we have about what is important. And so when we pay attention to the world, we have to make sure that we multiply, if you will, the scope of our attention, that we enrich, right, the information that is coming to our senses so that we can see more of the reality that truly exists. And so every year I teach innovation in the MBA program. In fact, Mike also did this a few years ago for a number of years. And so we give them a concrete challenge that they have to resolve for a week. And for 2 years, we entered all of the MBA students in this debut of farm competition, which looked at how can we improve the quality of life for patients at the hospital. And by the way, for 2 years in a row, the MBA students from IMD won that competition. It was an open innovation contest. And it all starts by how do we pay attention to issues, right, that exist in the hospital and solutions that could make sense. And so on one hand, we have to kind of zoom out. We have to make sure that we consider a number of stakeholder perspectives that truly matter. So if we're trying to change life at the hospital, then for sure we need to talk to the patients, but maybe we also need to talk to the doctors, to the nurses, to the hospital administrators, to the startup who are doing interesting things that could be applied to the hospital world. There's all kinds of stakeholders that we could consider that could inform the way we think about problems that exist, but also opportunities that could be created. But sometimes we also need to zoom in, right? So we need to not just have a broad view on all those perspectives that matter, but we need to spend and invest quality time, let's say with the nurse, because they can give us, right, a lot of useful and privileged information. But what we realize that often people are doing is they're zooming out, they're zooming in, they see the forest and not just the trees, but in fact, they're still looking at the wrong system. And what is important as well when you want to enrich your attention that you give to the world is to switch focus, to force yourself to consider maybe perspectives that you've not included because you thought they were irrelevant. So in this particular case, should you talk to the janitors, right, to improve the quality of life that patients have when they enter the hospital? Well, as it turns out, the janitors are working at the odd hours of the night. They may observe, behaviors from patients that are never being observed by the doctors. They might see what the patient is eating, throwing into the garbage bin. So they can have useful information about the diet and what is appreciated by the patients. So again, are we in a typical innovation journey to improve the quality of life for patients at the hospital talking to the janitors? Probably not. But an alien thinker would really force himself or herself to switch focus and amplify the kind of signals that are coming to his or her attention, right? And so that's kind of the first sort of lever, right? Do we pay good quality attention to the complexity of the world that we live in? Because there's more than one reality. Then the second lever that is not very talked about in innovation circles is what we call levitation, which is actually the opposite of attention, which is to stop looking, stop being immersed, right, in the reality of the context that you're trying to change, but rather be connected to yourself. Give yourself the space to think creatively about the future. Give yourself a chance to have some perspective, right? And here it's interesting because it goes back to how our brains work, right? There's been a lot of studies in neuroscience where they were trying to understand, how do people try to think about the future and how do innovative ideas actually emerge? And in the 80s, they did some very, very interesting experiments where they gave people two different types of tasks. One where they had to resolve complex, sophisticated, sort of math problems or language problems. And they put, sort of brain scans to try to understand what images, emerged and what parts of your brains would be activated. And then another group of people, they actually gave a different task, which is just relax, maybe take a little walk in the forest, just take a little nap if you prefer. And then they compare the two brain scans. And what is fascinating is that clearly different parts of the brain were activated, but the brains of people who were supposedly at rest, right? So taking a walk in the forest were 20 times more consuming of energy than the people who were actually doing a very complex cognitive task. And so they realized, well, this is kind of interesting, right? The mind at rest is far from being quiet. It is firing up neurons, like crazy. And in fact, now today, we know that the parts of your brain that are activated when you take some rest are the parts of the brain that are related to introspection, making sense of what you're doing, what works, what doesn't work, but also consolidating everything that you've learned, that you've seen, that you've felt, that you've heard in the past, consolidating those memories, if you will, and then using this consolidation to project a view on the future. So in other words, neuroscientists know that giving the space to your brain to operate those important cognitive processes is actually critical to coming up with new ideas for the future. And this is why also people who suffer from amnesia cannot easily have a view on the future. They freeze because they are not able, right, to create those connections in your minds. And so in innovation circles, we're always conceptualizing innovation as a race, right? You've got to do another test, another prototype. When in fact, if you really want to come up with radical ideas for the future, you need to step back, right? You need to stop what you're doing, separate yourself. You need to levitate, a little bit like what they do in sports. When you watch a game of basketball, if the action is not working as you hope so, right? What is it that the coach is going to do? Call for a timeout, right? Just take a little bit of time out and think about what you're doing and think about what should come next, right? So we have to be able to do that more in organizations as well, right? And there was a few years ago an interesting book called The Pause Principle that asked executives precisely, where do you come up with your best ideas? And this is what people said: in the shower, while exercising, right? Driving or commuting to work, right? Nobody mentioned in a meeting, talking to my colleagues, being busy doing something, right? Those eureka moments often come in those situations where you are not actively invested, right? In a concrete task, right? And so when you have the time to reflect. And so this is why you probably know this gentleman very well, Ferran Adrià, the chef who created El Bulli, elected 5 times best restaurant in the world, right? Was known for closing his restaurant 6 months every year so that he could give himself, right, a chance to rejuvenate, right, his creativity and imagine the new concepts and ideas for the future. And you can see how he comments on the question by a journalist asking, why are you closing El Bulli every year for 6 months? That's what he says. Now, of course, we cannot go to our bosses and say, I just need a 6-month sabbatical every year if you'd like me to be innovative. But there are things that you can do, right? We are all in control of our agendas, and to preserve some time for thinking, for reflection, for yourself, to make sense of the journey that you're on. When you're facing important problems, you need new ideas, new thinking, then take the time to reflect, take the time to levitate and separate yourself from the craziness of the world that we live in. Now, the third, sort of lever is about imagination, right? And often when you think about imagination, the way it is portrayed in many business schools, or we even get people to take personality tests sometimes where there is an attribute of your personality that is called imagination. And it conveys this idea that maybe there is a creative type, there is a creative genius, there is a prototype of a leader who somehow, is able to visualize the future, is able to come up with new ideas that will fundamentally change the way things get done in an industry or in a company. And for the rest of us, maybe we are left wondering, do we have the same skills, right? I mean, do we have the same DNA, creative genius that Steve Jobs and other famous figures have? And obviously at IMD, we don't subscribe to this view, right? Everybody has the capacity to innovate. Everybody has the capacity to come up with great, wonderful, different ideas that can bring progress to the world that we live in, right? We are all equipped with what it takes, but it just, matters like what you do in your job every day. And so imagination is a skill that we have when we are kids, and that is often nurtured throughout the years, but we tend to lose. And there is why, right? Here's a picture of a famous exercise that we run at IMD quite often, where we give executives 30 seconds to construct a duck. And you can see we give them 6 bricks of Lego, and we tell them you have about 30 seconds to construct a duck. And then we ask them to bring the ducks on the table in the middle of the room, and then we look at them. And if you look at this picture, you can see they're all great ducks, but they're all different, right? They all came up with a different duck, even though they all had the same bricks of Lego to play with. And that's really a good definition, right, of what we mean by imagination. Is this capacity that you have to create something new, not by visualizing an idea about something that could be in the future, but by playing, a little bit like kids do. You put things together in new and interesting ways, and that creates an imaginative concept. But you did not have a view on this concept when you started the experiment. And here I just tell them you have 30 seconds. So people don't have the time to think. They just do things. They just put things together, and then they do it sometimes in new and interesting ways. And therefore, they end up with a very imaginative kind of duck. But again, there was no or very little thinking going on into this process. And so can we give ourselves a chance to play more, right? To be able to just experience the future as it unfolds without a clear hypothesis at the start, simply by trying a few new things, seeing what happens, and learning a little bit like how kids venture into the world to develop their knowledge, right, about things that matter. And then there's a clear link between this view of imagination, if you will, and how do you come up with good ideas by playing and trying things out. And also how we practice experimentation in most organizations today, right? Everybody understands the importance of experimentation. We have ideas. We need to make sure that those ideas are perceived as valuable by customers or by the people we're trying to help. So it has to be desirable. It has to be an idea that is feasible, that we can implement, right? And it has to be viable. We have to be able to compensate, right, for the cost of deploying a particular solution. Otherwise, that idea is not going to be sustainable in the long term. And so we experiment, we test, right, quite a bit to make sure that we can demonstrate the merit. And so we build prototypes, and then we interview customers, other key stakeholders in an industry, and then we learn and we iterate our thinking. This is really central to the design thinking philosophy, to the lean startup, and people are doing that all the time. And yet, right, what we observe is that they have trouble, right, learning things that they really need to learn, right, if they want to iterate their thinking in a good way. And here I have an example, or we describe an example in a book that is quite famous of Dean Kamen, who is the inventor, as you can see, of the Segway. And obviously there was a lot of enthusiasm at the beginning when they started to visualize what the Segway could become and how it could reinvent mobility for entire cities. But they were so concerned about making sure that nobody would steal their ideas that they went through a lot of tests, if you will, but only within, right, their internal circle of friends, if you will. They were afraid of exposing their concepts to real customers because they were afraid of losing, right, their IP rights in the process. And so they went through a lot of experimentation, but without really interacting with the market. And they only got feedback that sort of reinforced what they actually believed was true, from the start. And that's what we observe. And today, obviously, they missed a lot of interesting information that could have been applied to develop a better mobility device. And of course, we can see it in shopping malls, we can see it in the parks and so on, but it certainly did not, become, right, the vehicle that they had imagined, at the start in terms of its commercial success. And that's what we see. There's one executive that told Mike and myself once, and it was a funny quote: if you torture the data long enough, it will confess. And that's what we do, right? We have a certain theory and hypothesis that we want to test, and we are looking for evidence that comforts our thinking, that confirms the assumptions that we have. We want to prove that the ideas that we have merit, instead of testing to learn something useful from the market and then iterating as a result. So the essence of experimentation is really to test to improve and not just to prove, right? Can we do that effectively? So the teams that we work on, Mike and I at IMD, we make sure that people always test several ideas in parallel, not just one, because the moment you test only one idea, of course, you want it to work, right? But if you test a lot of different concepts in parallel, then you're more open to the feedback. You're more open to let the data speak, if you will, and learn, right, from the experiments that you're running in the market. And then finally, navigation. And then we'll see how digital is changing all of this. But finally, navigation is, again, not like levitation, not very mentioned in innovation circles. Right? Navigation is really the act that is so important for any disruptive thinker that involves mapping the forces, if you will, in an organization, in an industry that can support your innovative ideas, or on the contrary, right, kill them when they start to emerge. And here, is an interesting story of a woman. Maybe you've heard about her. She's a legend in tech circles, Radia Perlman. She is, in fact, one of the key figures, if you will, that helped to bring the internet to life. She was most known for developing those famous STP protocols. I don't know if you remember that, but it's really the first time that somebody designed an infrastructure that helped computers communicate across company networks, right? At the time, people were again trying to protect, right, a corporate network and making sure there was no interference, right, with the outside. And she realized the potential of connecting thousands and thousands of computers across, right, company networks, and she developed the STP protocols for that. But what is interesting is that throughout her career, she faced so much resistance, right, from all of the colleagues that were surrounding her. When she was doing a postdoc program at MIT, she was developing computers for kids. And people were making fun of her, saying, you're just upset because nobody needs your stuff anymore. So now you're working on something totally irrelevant, computers for kids, because at the time, computers were not designed for kids. And then when she started to talk about computer networks across, right, company boundaries, people were extremely skeptical and say, your customers, our customers would never want to do that. It defies every single logic, right? And it did. Innovators, we've realized, often underestimate, right, the amount of resistance they might face, right, from stakeholders within the company that potentially could benefit from those innovations that you bring forward, but they don't quite see the value yet. Navigation involves, right, giving yourself a chance to navigate those forces and turn them to your advantage. And I'll finish with a very interesting parallel, if you will, of how two different innovators manage to do that or not, right? Often what you see is innovators that practice the submarine technique, right? So they hide. They sort of hide for as long as they can because they don't want to be noticed. The moment they are noticed, they might be killed. And then at some point they emerge. And then often this is when leaders notice, what they've been working on, don't necessarily see the value of it, and they might get shut down, right? So we cannot practice the submarine strategy for too long. We have to be able to do something different. And it all starts often with language. So here you have Steve Sasson, who was the engineer that created the first digital camera for Kodak. He organized a demo with all the leaders from Kodak, and he said, ladies and gentlemen, this is filmless photography. And you can see he's holding his camera in his hand. Now, of course, when you say filmless photography, you're alienating all the people in the room who believe in the power of film, right? Who believe in film as the key differentiating capability of the company that has explained the success of the company for so many years and made them so proud. And so it took Steve Sasson a few years before he evolved the language from filmless to digital film. And when he started to talk about digital film, he got a lot more support and created a lot more enthusiasm inside the company. And so often radical thinkers, right, are so proud of their differences and the novelty of their ideas that they emphasize that. They emphasize the truly creative aspects, but they fail to build bridges, right? If you want to succeed with very different ideas in an organization, you need to be a diplomatic rebel, right? These are the words of the innovation director at Lego, precisely, who said, you have to build bridges, right? Before you break things, you have to build bridges. Otherwise, you will be perceived as a loose cannon, as a misfit, as an alien that may need to be shot. Now, you compare that strategy, and that's my last example, with the one that Jonathan Legler used. Jonathan was actually doing his PhD at EPFL just here in Lausanne, and he was working in drones. But before he did his PhD on drones at EPFL, he was a war journalist for The Economist. And he was traveling in all kinds of conflicts, often that were at war. And then he noticed that in many parts of Africa and also Afghanistan, they were using donkeys to transport small loads of medication, right, to very remote parts that could not be reached by road or air. And they were using those donkeys. And it didn't take very long for him to think, we could use drones instead, right? It would be safer, faster, cheaper to do that. But of course, he could have gone to see the chefs of the village. And so, let's put drones infrastructure into your villages. And maybe he would have not created a lot of enthusiasm. Instead, he said, what if we could put your donkeys into the sky? And he created a company called Flying Donkeys that did precisely that. And he really used a language that resonated, right, with key stakeholders and the chefs of the African villages. Donkeys in the sky, that's a concept they were willing to support. And so if you think about it, right, there's many different things that innovators have to be able to do to pay attention to the world in richer ways, to separate themselves from the craziness of the world that we live in so that they create the space to reflect, to connect concepts in new and interesting ways. Right? They observe interesting practices that exist in different industries. They put them together And that's imagination, to experiment, to improve, not just to prove, and to navigate those forces that can kill them, right? As they come up with radical ideas that conflict, right, with the existing way of doing things. And so that's a framework that we describe in the book, and clearly that can explain and help you when you're trying to resolve very, very important problems that exist in your own work context or in your own lives. Do this, and you'll maximize your chances of being more creative. And what we were looking also in the book is, how can we use digital technologies these days to do things differently? And this is where, for the next 20 minutes, Mike is going to show us, right, how can we use technology, right, and how can we amplify, if you will, the power of our thinking, right, and creativity using those tools. And there's quite a few things that we can do, Mike.
Absolutely right. There are, and I think digital technologies have opened up a lot of windows to us. They've removed a lot of barriers, and there's also COVID. So I want to kind of talk about what innovation, creativity means in times of COVID, and also how digital tools and technology can amplify your creativity and innovativeness today. I'm also going to share slides, so just bear with me just 1 second. Let me start with this. In the pandemic, where you are at the moment, restaurants may be open, they may not be open. I'm in Spain right now, and restaurants are closed, but they're opening next week. And when they open, and maybe where you are as well, it's quite likely that when you go to a restaurant, you no longer get a paper menu that you hold in your hand because of the COVID restrictions. So instead of that, what often happens, and you may have experienced this as well, is that you get a QR code, and then you use the QR code on your phone. And then what happens? Well, what normally happens is that you will see the menu on the phone, and then you can browse the menu just as you would browsing a paper menu. And I think that's the key there. It's just as you would. Maybe the menu on your phone is a PDF of the actual menu. Maybe it's on a website, but it kind of looks and feels a lot like the traditional paper menu. To us, this is a huge opportunity missed for restaurants. It's a huge opportunity missed. Don't imagine, actually type it into the chat window. What could a restaurant do once they've got a diner going on to online through a QR code? What could happen? What could happen in that case? Just type in your answers into the chat. So let's see how creative you are and how innovative you are. What could you see once you use that QR code at a restaurant? All right, let's see. Because right now, as we know, it's pretty dull, right? You're just seeing the menu itself. Okay, we're seeing some really cool ideas here. This is great. Videos, absolutely. You can see videos of the food. You can see pictures of the food. You can see videos of the food being made. That's right. You could meet the chef, talk about the cooking process. Nutritional information, that's a great idea. Reviews, of course. You don't just need to see a static picture of the dishes. You could see reviews. What have other diners thought about the different dishes? Pairings, exactly, wine pairings or pairings of starters with main courses. You can order, Jan, absolutely. You can order the food. You can pay for it. So there's all kinds of things that could be there that if restaurants really think creatively that other types of benefits they could be offering to diners, that just most of them are not doing that. And so it's not that the opportunities are not there, it's more that they're not being taken advantage of. And Victor, Joao, great, yeah, pre-order, you could do that, translations, Pedro, Victor, meet the chef, all these things. So, COVID, because things are so remote now, kind of give us an opportunity to use digital tools in a different way. So the question that I want to explore is, how can digital tools and technologies amplify exactly what Cyril was talking about alien thinking, and really about shifting it from just pure digitization. And digitization is taking a paper menu and making a PDF version online, to digital and true digital innovation, where you're doing all the things that you're noting here in the chat, all these great ideas. So there's a few different ways that can happen. And one of the ways that digital tools can give us is they can give us access to data without observation. Now, in the past, if you wanted to observe, and of course, all innovation methodologies talk about the importance of observing, but before, you kind of had to do that, go out and do that. Ethnologists like Margaret Mead spent years, living with tribes in Papua New Guinea and other places. Now, a lot of that can be automated, right? We have digital tools that we can automate that process. If you want to learn about communities, just go to Reddit and just, browse around some of those sub-communities there. Digital sensors and beacons and other tools, IoT, can help you collect data. So here's an example of basketball. Now, it was the Toronto Raptors, my hometown basketball team, that put sensors in the jerseys of the players to try and track their movements and see what they could learn from those movements. So they did this over a period of time. And I'm going to launch a poll here. So you should see on your screen a poll popping up. And so I'm going to ask what do you think they learned from this? What do you think they learned? Okay, so there's a few different options. First option, they learned that smaller players moved 1.3 times faster than larger players. Second, players move forward only 15% of the time. Three, players that scored the most points moved the least distance. Or four, all of the above. All right, which one of these do you think is the correct answer? And what they learned after a period of time with the sensors in the shirts. So the big winner is all of the above. It is not the correct answer, unfortunately. The correct answer is the one the least number of you chose, which is number 2. What they learned, in fact, was that players during games only move forward 15% of the time. So 85% of the time, they're either moving sideways or they're moving backwards. Now, this was stunning to them. They had no idea this was the case. Now, why is it relevant? They never trained backwards or sideways. They didn't spend a lot of time in the gym or in the physio, working on those muscles that you need to move backwards or sideways. And so they started spending more time developing those skills, working on those muscles, practicing those movements. And what they found was that they reduced the number of injuries significantly. And that's a big part of success on a basketball team, any kind of sports team, is injuries. Games lost, hours lost to injury. And because they were paying attention to those different muscle groups and so forth, that moving sideways and backwards, they actually reduce the number of injuries. And if you follow basketball, you know that 2 seasons ago, they won a championship. Not for only this reason, but that was a part of it. Here's another example from the world of sports. Many of you run, I suppose, and so Nike has some shoes that are designed specifically for runners, and they tend to be quite pricey. And many of they're now connected, and because they're connected, the shoes are connected, that Nike can actually learn how those shoes are being used. And interestingly enough, what they discovered from the data they collected from these very, very expensive connected running shoes was that more than 95% of the time, the shoes were not being used for running at all. They were being used for walking. People were actually buying these very expensive running shoes and they were walking with them. Which is not how they were supposed to. They're not how they were designed or how they're supposed to be used. They're not actually optimized for walking. It's a different gait. It's a different way of moving. So people were buying these very, very expensive shoes and using them in an inappropriate way, at least depending on, compared with how they were designed. So this allowed Nike to take this data and then redesign the shoes, rethink the marketing campaigns, because they had access to this data that they didn't have before, because they were not able to observe. Another example, I think, is it Mark? Give me a thumbs up, Mark. Mark Miller, you're there. You're from Montreux, right? You're sitting in Montreux. So this is Montreux right now. This is Montreux in Switzerland. And it's kind of the very end of the Lake of Geneva. This view here is very similar to Cyril Bouquet's view in his new house. This is pretty basically what he sees. And it's kind of the entrance of the gateway into the Alps. So you can see here, there's this road behind the city and on the edge of the mountain there. And that's the highway that goes into the mountain. So when people go skiing, it often bunches up there. You get these big traffic jams going on that road. So what do people do is they just go through the town instead, right? So the town of Montreux was seeing a lot of increased traffic because of this. And so they thought, what are we going to do about that? Maybe we should build a tunnel. Maybe we should build another bridge. Maybe we should build some kind of a bypass. But they wanted to collect more data. And traditionally, what they would do, if they wanted to collect more data, is they would hire people with the gilets jaunes, right? The yellow jackets. They would put things on the road that would count the number of cars. This is time consuming, this is expensive, and it could be quite dangerous to do that. Instead, they made an agreement with Switzerland's national telecom provider. Well, not national anymore, the old national one, but it still has 60% of the market share, and that's Swisscom. Because Swisscom could actually give them all the data they needed without putting anybody on the ground. Because they can see that 60% market share, they can see with the phones the way they were moving. And what they learned from, that period of observation, which, by the way, could be done in a couple of days rather than weeks because they have the data, was that in fact they could solve the problem without any new infrastructure, just by changing the way the lanes were used, changing the way the traffic lights were positioned. So it's actually saved them a lot of money. So digital tools give you the opportunity to collect data without observation. Another way that digital tools can help is to provide insights without biases. Okay, so here's I'm going to ask you a question about Steve. So here's the description of Steve. Steve is very shy and withdrawn. Steve is invariably helpful, but with little interest in people or in the world of reality. Steve is a humble and tidy soul. He has a need for order and structure and a passion for detail. So this is Steve. So my question to you is do you think, and I'll launch this as a poll, do you think that Steve is more likely to be a farmer or a librarian? There we go. So do you think Steve is more likely to be a farmer or a librarian? What do you think? All right. So a little more than 60% of you thought Steve is more likely to be a farmer, and 38% thought Steve was more likely to be a librarian. All right, so quite a few of you thought librarian, but the majority of you thought farmer. Right? So actually, we tend to have a lot of biases, and one of our biases that we have as people is that we focus too much on what's in front of us. So as I read the description, and you probably thought about the description, and you probably thought about stereotypes you have of farmers and librarians, but I suppose very few of you consider the underlying data in this particular case, particularly population data. And you think about anywhere where you are in the world at the moment, any country you are in the world, the number of farmers versus the number of librarians. And then consider male versus female, the number of male farmers versus the number of male librarians. And almost anywhere in the world, you're going to have many more male farmers than male librarians. So the odds are that Steve is a farmer, not a librarian. But the problem is we have all these biases, and the data can kind of see beyond those biases, right? Here's an example. I suppose that some of you have met the love of your life and are extremely happy together. And I suppose some of you are still single, but have the aspiration to meet the love of your life and be together forever, to make a partner for life. Now we have data. And we have data from dating sites. So when you go on a dating site, you have to fill out questions, usually dozens and dozens and dozens of questions. And they use these questions to try and match people together on compatibility. So they have a lot of data and they know which couples stayed together and which couples didn't. And so I'll launch one last poll here about the data that they found out. What do you think is the best predictor of couples not only falling in love, but staying together? What do you think is best predictor of all the data that they have? What do you think the best predictor is? The choices are comparative attitudes about having children, comparative attitudes about money and finances, comparative attitudes about horror movies, comparative socioeconomic status. So people are in similar bands socioeconomically, and age. Which one do you think is the highest predictor of couples falling in love and staying together? Okay, the winner is the comparative socioeconomic status. Turned out not to be very significant. That turned out not to be very significant. Comparative attitude about money and finances, also not very significant. Children, not very significant. The most significant factor was horror movies, actually. Was the attitude, and it was a positive correlation. So if you both enjoyed horror movies, that was a strong positive predictor of staying together. If one did and one didn't, then that was a strong negative predictor of couples falling in love and staying together. So you're probably thinking now, or asking your partner, what do you think about horror movies? That was the number one predictor. And why? I mean, it doesn't actually matter that much why. The important thing is that's what the data is telling us, and the data is unbiased in this case. By the way, the second most strong predictor was the answer to the question, would you go on a holiday alone? Or would you go visit another country by yourself? Again, it was a positive correlation. So these are the top two predictors whether couples fall in love. Another way that the digital can help is through trial without error. Now, Cyril already talked about Solar Impulse having a digital twin, and if you're gonna experiment with a plane, there's a pretty big risk of failure, and then when the failure happens, it's catastrophic. So, being able to test in the digital world with a digital twin actually gives you the option to trial without any error or damage. And another way you can do that, of course, is through A/B testing. So all digial companies do this. So you can make very, very continual experimentation, very, very small. We're not talking radical here. There was a note in the chat earlier. Radical innovation can be very difficult, challenging. Well, you don't need to be radical. If you make enough very, very small innovations over time, they become radically different. So try without error is another benefit. And then finally, scale without compromise. This is what digital tools can give you. And I think a really good contemporary example right now is what's happening with Wall Street Bets sub community on Reddit around the GameStop shares. So this is where a community of people got together to take on the big short sellers, right? The big hedge funds, and actually managed to build the scale to fight and make significant gains against these really, really big players. So you can get scale without the normal compromises that come with that. So I know we're running short of time. So just in summary, how can digital tools and technologies amplify what Cyril talked about? They can do so by giving you data without observation, by giving you insights without the same biases you normally have, by allowing you to do experimentation without necessarily error, trial without error, and finally give you the benefit of scale without as much compromise as before. Finally, the last thing I want to say, we've collected a lot of data recently in the pandemic, trying to understand how some companies are outperforming others. And one of the things that came through very strongly in the data is that innovation is a differentiator. Those organizations that placed a high priority on innovation, particularly digital innovation, significantly outperformed organizations that either had a low priority or a medium priority. All right, I see that we're very, very close to time, so I will stop sharing here and see if we have any questions. Cyril, I see you were typing away like a madman there. Are there things going on?
Well, you had the time to observe what I was doing. I mean, I had like sort of two chat windows open in front of me. There's kind of the main chat, and then there were a bunch of questions that were highlighted that I was trying to answer. So hopefully this went through, and indeed a lot of super interesting questions. So thank you so much for for the interest, the enthusiasm. And I think we could get to as many as we could during that session, right? And thank you guys. It was a pleasure to connect with you. I think we are out of time, so we should probably again encourage people to connect with us on LinkedIn, on Twitter, and obviously to continue the discussion with you, right? I mean, I'm sure that you have a lot of interesting problems and opportunities in your own context. Share your stories with us through LinkedIn, through Twitter. We love to hear more about it, and use the hashtag Alien Thinking, right? And the book is going to come out.
And maybe we close on a note of empowerment. One thing we've learned is that anybody can be an innovator, right? And anybody can be an alien thinker. All of you have creativity within you. It may be trapped. But you just need to release it. It's a learned behavior. It's not magic. It's not innate. It's not a trait that you're born with. It's learned, because everything we've studied suggests that this is learned behavior. So if you have the right tools, if you have the right attitude, then you can become a creative innovator today. And I think with COVID, with the situation we're in, the environment right now is better than it's ever been to do that.
Very good. So have a wonderful end of the day, wherever you are in the world, or a good night for those who are calling from Australia. And we look forward to more conversations in the future. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.